Good morning. Today is actually my 19th wedding anniversary and my husband is here in the congregation with us today. As it is an assessed preach and my anniversary, I did think, I'm going to preach on something that I really love. And so today I am preaching on food. Yes, food. You will be surprised to learn that despite my racing snake figure, I am very qualified to talk about food. Now, did you know that one of the first things people knew about the early Christians was that they ate together? Every week they gathered together, the rich, the poor, slaves, free, Jew, Gentile, women and men. They all ate together to celebrate Christ's resurrection. And certainly pre-pandemic, we did a lot of eating together, didn't we? I miss eating a bacon sarnie or 3 with you before we start our worship. And I guess in the modern church, we are still sharing food every time we take communion together and share in that feast. Now, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is told 6 times in the Gospels, and the astute amongst you will of course know there's only 4 Gospels, so it's told twice in 2 of them. So I think we can all deduce this is a big deal. Jesus feeding 5,000 people is one of those miracles we hear about a lot. It defies comprehension and it calls on us to believe that something inexplicable happened. Many through the centuries have tried to explain it away, but the nature of the miracle is not the aspect of the story that I want to look at this morning. Rather, I want to look at the disciples and what it tells us about being a follower of Jesus today. Because whether or not Jesus molecularly multiplied the bread and the fish, or whether the crowds opened up their stingy lunch boxes and shared their sandwiches and their frazzles, what strikes me is that the disciples must have learnt from the experience. Namely, that there was more available to them than what they themselves were bringing to the table. 5,000 people is a lot of people. It's not a surprise that the disciples wanted them to go away and fend for themselves. They have nothing but 5 loaves and a couple of fish. But Jesus says, I can work with that. He has the people sit down and he takes the bread and the fish and gives thanks for them. And we know how the rest of this story goes. There's not only enough to feed all of them, there's more than enough. This really encourages me, and I think about what we can achieve here together in Stystead. Over the past 20 years or so that I've been coming to worship here, I've sometimes got the sense that we regard ourselves as the poor relation. We are a small worshipping community. We don't serve a huge population. We don't have a building with significant artistic merit, much as we love this building. But we do have each other. I am genuinely thrilled that we are starting to grow as a community of faith, and I am delighted others in our church family are generously offering their time and talents to help us. Occasionally, we look at the smallness of our own offering and the insignificance of our abilities, the inadequacy of our gifts compared against the greatness of whatever need we are facing. And we think it's a reason to feel overwhelmed or Worse yet, embarrassment. It's tempting, isn't it, to act as though smallness, inadequacy, and insignificance are things that would never be worthy enough to be brought before God. And yet, every parable about God's kingdom, every teaching Jesus ever had about how God creates something glorious, starts with something small. Never once did Jesus say, the kingdom of heaven is like a FTSE 100 company. We're full of shiny, happy shareholders. It's always something small, overlooked, insignificant. These are the things that reveal the glory of God. This tale about a giant picnic is a story that started with inadequacy and need. We hear the story of the little boy who shared his lunch, but within the story there lies more than 5,000 others. The story of the skinny orphan, the skeptical tax collector, the despised Samaritan, the curious fisherman, the struggling widow, the disdained prostitute, the wealthy mother, the angry zealot, the ostracized Canaanite, the banished leper, the suffering slave, the repentant sinner, and ultimately, the story of you and me. It's the story of a crowd of people who had little in common except that they were hungry for food, for healing, and for Jesus. And it's the story of a crowd of people who were fed, no questions asked, no prerequisites demanded, no standards of holiness to meet first. It's the story of people who were shown that what they have is not the end of the story. In this story, we see Jesus addressing the most essential physical needs of his fellow human beings: hunger, thirst, community, and breaking down every socially constructed barrier that keeps us from eating with one and another. He did the same thing when, much to the annoyance of the religious leaders, he dined with tax collectors and prostitutes and told his more well-to-do hosts that when you give a banquet, invite the crippled, the lame, the blind. Then you will be blessed. Jesus' critics repeatedly drew attention to the fact that he dined with the wrong people by eating with the sinners and the outcasts, the unclean. Jesus was repeatedly saying, "These are my companions. These are my friends." It was this sort of thing that got him killed. Here at All Saints, we come together at least once a month, don't we, to feast on the bread of life. All who share this feast, who bring their hunger, are dinner guests of Christ. When the Bible talks about the kingdom, this is it, here, right now. All of us gathered together, not because we are worthy or good, but because we are hungry, because we long for more. This is what it is to be a disciple. Whatever the nature of this miracle, it is there in the everyday. We sometimes make the mistake of thinking that only ritual and ceremony are worship. We might think of the sacraments of the church, things like baptism, confirmation, Holy Communion. We think these things help us to encounter the compassion and generosity and companionship of God. And they do. But what sacrament really means is to make holy. Sometimes in the church we're tempted to hide God behind beautiful things, and we become hung up on these objects rather than what they point to. Learning to see God is learning to see with new eyes. When we have eyes to see, even ordinary things become holy. Flowers, the food bank, pastoral networks, village pantry, choir practice, the toddler group, the cleaning, the coffee, the bacon rolls, the chat. This stuff matters. These things are holy. They help us to encounter the compassion and generosity and companionship of God. Because you know, the signs and wonders of Jesus never cease. Never cease. This is a God who never runs out of holy things. The God who multiplied wine at a wedding, turned 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish into a lunch to feed 5,000 with baskets of leftovers, is the same God who is like a shepherd who leaves his flock in search of a single lamb. And you know what? We have a choice every day to join in the revelry, to share the picnic, drink the wine of undeserved grace. To do this, we need to know our hunger, our inadequacy, that we cannot do it by ourselves. We need one another and we need God. Now, history has shown that there have always been people who fancy themselves as being bouncers to the heavenly banquet. And perhaps when we forget our own need, we run this risk of becoming like this. People who are charged with keeping the wrong people away from the table and out of church. But the gospel doesn't need a coalition devoted to keeping the wrong people out. It needs a family of sinners committed to tearing down the walls, throwing open the doors and welcoming all to bread and wine, to companionship. This isn't a kingdom for the worthy, it's a kingdom for the hungry. So whoever you are, if you are hungry, come and eat. You don't need to earn a spot. It is given. Our God is in the business of transforming the most ordinary things into holy things. Scraps of food into feasts. And if God says to us, what do you have to offer? And all we can say is nothing, God replies, I can work with that. Amen.